This happened about 3 years ago, when I was 21 and desperate for money to cover my college tuition. I managed to land a job at a small, independently owned gas station. It wasn't your typical bright, bustling rest stop on an interstate. This place was situated on a 2-lane highway cutting right through a dense, heavily wooded part of the Pacific Northwest. During the day, it was scenic. At night, it was pitch black, isolating, and honestly pretty depressing. I usually worked the graveyard shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Most nights consisted of drinking terrible coffee, stocking shelves, and maybe seeing 2 or 3 truckers passing through. But there's one night I will never, ever forget. It was mid-November, and a massive storm had rolled in. The rain wasn't just falling, it was coming down in thick, violent sheets, accompanied by thunder that shook the cheap foundation of the convenience store. The wind was howling through the tall pine trees that surrounded the lot, and the rain whipped against the glass storefront so hard I thought the windows might shatter. It was around 3 a.m. I hadn't seen a single car in over 2 hours. I was sitting behind the counter, scrolling through my phone, just waiting for the sun to come up. Suddenly, the little bell above the door chimed. I jumped, startled by the noise. The heavy glass door swung open, letting in a furious gust of wind and rain. A man stepped inside. He looked to be in his late 30s, wearing a dark green canvas jacket, jeans, and work boots. At first glance, there was nothing particularly threatening about him, but as he stood there in the doorway, my brain struggled to process something that felt entirely wrong. It took me a few seconds to realize what it was. He was completely dry. Outside, a literal monsoon was flooding the parking lot. There was no car parked up by the pumps, meaning he had to have walked from somewhere further out. Yet, there wasn't a single drop of water on his jacket. His hair wasn't matted down. He didn't even have mud on his boots. It was as if he had just stepped out of a dry, climate-controlled living room rather than a severe thunderstorm. "Hey man, how's it going?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though a cold knot was already forming in my stomach. He didn't browse the aisles. He didn't head for the coolers. He walked straight up to the counter, stopped about 3 feet away, and just stared at me. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and entirely devoid of emotion. "I need your help," he said. His voice was flat, almost robotic. "I have a heavy box in the back of my van. I can't lift it alone. I need you to come outside and help me move it." He raised a hand and pointed out the window. I squinted through the rain-streaked glass. Parked at the very edge of the lot, right where the fluorescent lights ended and the pitch-black tree line began, was an old, beaten-up white cargo van. It had no windows in the back. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me. You don't work the night shift in the middle of nowhere without developing a sixth sense for danger, and everything about this guy was setting off alarms. The dry clothes, the windowless van parked in the darkest corner of the lot, the weirdly specific request. "I'm sorry, man," I said, forcing a polite retail smile. "I'm the only one here. Store policy says I can't leave the register unattended." The man didn't move. His expression didn't change, but his tone suddenly dropped an octave. "It's a really heavy box. It'll only take a minute. Just come outside." "I can't do that," I replied, my heart starting to hammer against my ribs. "Look, if you're having car trouble or need roadside assistance, I can call a tow truck for you. Or I can call the non-emergency police line, and maybe an officer in the area can give you a hand." The moment I mentioned the police, his demeanor shifted from blank to aggressively hostile. He leaned over the counter, invading my space. "I don't need a damn tow truck. I don't need the cops. I need you to step outside right now and help me." I took a step back, my hand instinctively reaching beneath the counter. We didn't have a weapon, but we did have a panic button, and right next to it was the small monitor for our security cameras. We had 4 cameras. Camera 1 covered the register, camera 2 and 3 covered the pumps, camera 4 pointed toward the far edge of the lot, exactly where his van was parked. I glanced down at the grainy black and white feed. The night vision was struggling through the heavy rain, but as a flash of lightning illuminated the sky outside, the screen lit up for a fraction of a second. My blood ran completely cold. Behind the white van, crouched low to the ground to stay out of sight from the store windows, were two other figures. I couldn't make out their faces, but I could clearly see what they were holding. One had a thick coil of rope. The other was holding something long and metallic, maybe a tire iron or a pipe. They were waiting for me. I looked back up at the man. He was still glaring at me, waiting for me to walk around the counter. "I'm pressing the silent alarm," I said, my voice trembling but loud enough for him to hear. I grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight we kept under the register and held it up. "The cops are on their way. You need to get the hell out of here." For a split second, I thought he was going to vault over the counter, but instead the rage vanished from his face, replaced instantly by that dead, blank stare. Without saying another word, he turned around and walked briskly out the door. He didn't even bother to close it behind him. I rushed around the counter, slammed the heavy glass door shut, and threw the deadbolt. Through the window, I watched him jog, finally getting wet, towards the van. He jumped into the driver's seat, and the two figures in the back scrambled through the rear doors. The van peeled out of the lot, tires spinning on the wet asphalt, and disappeared down the dark highway without turning its headlights on. I called 911 immediately. The cops arrived about 20 minutes later, but by then the van was long gone. The next morning, my manager came in to relieve me. After hearing the story and showing the police the security footage, an officer took me aside to take a formal statement. That's when he told me something that still keeps me awake when it rains. The white van had been found abandoned about 10 miles up the road. It was stolen from a neighboring county 2 days prior. But the scariest part? The officer told me that over the past 5 years, 3 young men had gone missing along that specific stretch of highway. All of their cars were found abandoned on the shoulder, and all of them had vanished during severe thunderstorms.
If you've ever driven cross-country alone, you know how incredibly hypnotic the road can get at night. The white lines blur together, the radio fades into white noise, and your brain basically goes on autopilot. I was moving from Colorado to Oregon for a new job, packed to the brim in my small Honda Civic. It was the second day of the trip, and my plan was to push through the night to reach Portland by morning. But the weather had other plans. Around 1 a.m., somewhere in the deep, heavily forested mountains of the Pacific Northwest, a torrential storm hit. The rain didn't just fall, it dumped from the sky in heavy, violent buckets. The windshield wipers were on their maximum setting, violently slapping back and forth, but they couldn't clear the water fast enough. The roads began to flood, and visibility dropped to absolute zero. It became clear that if I kept driving, I was going to hydroplane and crash. I needed to pull over, just until the worst of the storm passed. Through the dense sheets of rain, my headlights caught a faded, reflective blue sign indicating a rest area ahead. I took the exit, tires splashing through deep puddles, and pulled into a desolate, unlit parking lot. It wasn't one of those nice interstate stops with vending machines and bathrooms. It was just a large, cracked asphalt clearing surrounded by towering, impenetrable pine trees. Right in front of my car was a steep, heavily wooded ravine. I was the only car there. Exhausted, I put the car in park, killed the engine, and locked the doors. The sound of the rain drumming relentlessly against the metal roof of my car was incredibly loud, but strangely comforting. It created a cocoon of white noise, a false sense of security that made me feel entirely hidden from the outside world. I leaned my seat back, pulled my hoodie over my eyes, and almost instantly fell into a deep sleep. I don't know how much time passed before I woke up. It could have been 20 minutes, it could have been 2 hours, but something pulled me out of my sleep. It wasn't a sound. The rain was still deafening. It was a physical sensation. My car was moving. It was a subtle, rhythmic swaying, left to right, up and down. Creak, sway, creak, sway. At first, in my groggy state, I thought it was just the sheer force of the wind pushing against the vehicle. But as I sat up in the pitch-black cabin, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, I realized the movement was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Then came a violent jolt from the back of the car. The front tires rolled forward an inch. My heart slammed against my ribs. I turned my head slowly, looking over my shoulder out the rear window. It was too dark to see anything through the rain-streaked glass. But then, a massive fork of lightning spiderwebbed across the sky, illuminating the parking lot in a flash of cold blue light. There was someone standing behind my car.
In that split second of illumination, I saw a tall, soaking wet silhouette. The person had both hands planted flat on my trunk, their shoulders hunched forward. They weren't trying to peer through the windows, they weren't trying the door handles or trying to break in to steal my things. They were violently rocking the back of my car, using an impossible amount of physical strength, trying to push my vehicle forward, over the edge of the asphalt, down into the steep black ravine. Panic flooded my veins. Another heavy shove sent the car inching closer to the drop-off. I fumbled blindly in the dark for my keys, which I had tossed into the passenger seat. My hands were shaking so violently, I knocked them onto the floorboard. Thump. Creak. The car moved another few inches. The front tires were now resting on the very lip of the muddy embankment leading down into the dark abyss. If they pushed it just a little harder, gravity would take over and I would plunge down into the trees. I dove down, my fingers desperately scraping against the carpet until I felt the cold metal of the keys. I scrambled back into the driver's seat and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I immediately slammed my foot onto the brake pedal to stop the car from rolling any further forward. I shifted into reverse and instinctively flicked on the high-beam headlights. Because the car was angled downward, the headlights shot straight into the trees, but the bright red glow of my taillights illuminated the space right behind me. I looked up into the rearview mirror, expecting to see the face of a madman. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. The person had stopped pushing. They had stepped around to the side of the trunk, bathed in the red glow of the brake lights. The figure was standing perfectly still, facing the driver's side mirror. But it didn't have a face. Where the eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was nothing but smooth, pale, glistening skin. The head was perfectly featureless, like a terrifying blank mannequin staring blindly into my soul. A scream caught in my throat. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal. The tires spun furiously, squealing and smoking against the wet asphalt as they fought for traction. For a terrifying second, I thought I was stuck, but then the tires caught. The car shot backward, throwing me against the steering wheel. I cranked the wheel hard, spinning the car around 180 degrees to face the exit. As the car whipped around, my headlights swept in a wide arc across the dark parking lot, piercing through the heavy rain. And that's when I saw the rest of them. Standing in the heavy downpour, lined up along the very edge of the tree line, were dozens of them. Tall, soaking wet silhouettes. They were all completely motionless, their blank, featureless heads turned perfectly toward my car. They had just been standing there in the dark, silently waiting for the first one to finish its job. I didn't stop until the sun came up and I was 3 states away. I've never driven at night since, and if it ever starts raining while I'm on the road, I pull into a crowded, brightly lit gas station. You couldn't pay me $1 million to sleep at an empty rest stop again. You never know what's waiting for you in the dark, perfectly comfortable in the rain.
They say your home is supposed to be your sanctuary, the one place where you can completely let your guard down. But whenever I hear the heavy drumming of rain against my roof, I'm reminded of how easily that illusion of safety can be shattered. It was the week of Thanksgiving, and my family, my parents, my younger sister, and I were supposed to be flying to Florida for a week-long vacation. We had packed the car, locked up the house, set the security alarm, and driven 2 hours to the airport in a torrential downpour. But the storm was worse than anyone anticipated. After sitting at the gate for 4 hours, our flight was officially canceled. Disappointed and exhausted, we grabbed our luggage, trudged back through the flooded parking garage, and drove home. By the time we pulled into our driveway, it was pushing midnight. The storm had escalated into a full-blown tempest. Thunder was shaking the ground, and the rain was so heavy you could barely see the front porch. We ran to the front door, getting completely soaked in the process. My dad unlocked the deadbolt, and my mom immediately punched our 4-digit code into the alarm keypad to disarm it. The panel beeped cheerfully, glowing green. Everything seemed perfectly normal. The house was pitch black, quiet, and exactly as we had left it just 6 hours earlier. We dragged our suitcases into the hallway. My parents were arguing quietly about rebooking the flight, and my sister crashed on the living room couch. I just wanted to get out of my wet clothes and go to sleep. I grabbed my duffel bag and headed upstairs to my bedroom. The sound of the rain lashing against the roof was deafening on the second floor. I walked into my room, didn't even bother turning on the main overhead light, and just clicked on the small lamp on my nightstand. The dim, warm light illuminated the room, and immediately my stomach dropped. You know that strange, instinctual feeling you get when your personal space has been altered? It's hard to explain, but you just know. The chair at my desk was pulled out, rotated to face my bed. I always pushed it in. One of my dresser drawers was cracked open about an inch, and my closet door, which I obsessively kept shut because I hate looking into the dark space at night, was ajar just a tiny fraction of an inch. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, my duffel bag hanging loosely from my shoulder. I told myself I was just being paranoid. I was tired, irritated, and my brain was playing tricks on me. But then, my eyes darted down to the floor at the base of the closet door. From the thin, vertical crack of the slightly open door, a very faint yellowish beam of light was spilling out onto the carpet. It looked like the beam of a small penlight. As I stared at it, the light suddenly flicked off. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream. The only sound was the violent storm raging outside my window. I kept my eyes locked on the inch of space beneath the closet door. A shadow slowly slid across the bottom gap, blocking out the ambient light from my lamp. It was the distinct silhouette of 2 shoes. Someone was standing inside my closet, less than 10 feet away from me. They had been looking through the crack. They knew I was standing there, and they were holding their breath, waiting to see what I would do. Every survival instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to move slowly. I took a deliberate step backward, trying to make it seem natural, then another. I backed out of my bedroom, and the second I crossed the threshold into the hallway, I turned and sprinted silently down the carpeted stairs. I burst into the kitchen, pale and shaking. My dad took one look at my face and immediately dropped his phone. "There is someone in my closet," I whispered, my voice trembling so hard I could barely form the words. My dad didn't ask questions. He walked to the umbrella stand by the front door, pulled out a heavy aluminum baseball bat, and motioned for me to stay downstairs with my mom and sister. But I couldn't let him go up there alone. I followed right behind him. We crept up the stairs. The thunder rumbled loudly, masking the sound of our footsteps. When we reached my open bedroom door, my dad raised the bat and flicked on the main overhead light. "I'm armed and the police are on their way," my dad yelled, using his most intimidating, authoritative voice. "Come out right now with your hands up." Silence. We waited for the closet door to open, but instead of the door moving, we heard a sudden violent crash from inside the closet, followed by the frantic sound of drywall tearing. My dad lunged forward and ripped the closet door open, raising the bat. The closet was empty, but the square wooden panel in the ceiling, the access hatch to the attic crawlspace, was pushed completely out of the way. Dust and insulation were raining down onto my clothes. From above our heads, we could hear the heavy, frantic thumping of footsteps scrambling across the wooden joists of the attic, running toward the back of the house. My dad immediately yelled for my mom to call 911. The police arrived in less than 5 minutes.
They cleared the main house with guns drawn, then brought in a tactical ladder to access the attic. When the officers climbed up there with their heavy-duty flashlights, the intruder was already gone. He had kicked out a wooden ventilation lower at the far end of the attic, crawled out onto the wet roof, and dropped down into the dense woods behind our property, disappearing into the storm. But it's what the police found up in the attic that still gives me night terrors. Right above my bedroom, nestled between the fiberglass insulation, was a makeshift living space. There was a dirty sleeping bag, empty water bottles, food wrappers from our pantry, and jars filled with urine. This person hadn't just broken in to rob us, they had been living up there. But the most horrifying discovery was a small corkboard leaning against a wooden beam. Pinned to it were dozens of candid photographs of my family. Pictures of my mom cooking in the kitchen, pictures of me sleeping, pictures of my sister watching TV. They had all been taken from inside the house, likely while we were completely unaware. Next to the board was a spiral notebook. It was a diary filled with pages of meticulous handwritten notes detailing our exact daily routines. Dad leaves for work at 7:30. Mom goes to the gym at 9. Kids return from school at 3:15. Family leaving for Florida, November 22nd, flight at 8 p.m. He knew we were supposed to be gone for a week. He thought he had the entire house to himself to roam freely. The police never caught the guy. The storm washed away any footprints or scent trails outside. But there is one final sickening detail that destroyed our family's peace of mind forever. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere on the exterior doors or windows. And remember, my mom had used the keypad to disarm the alarm when we walked inside. The alarm was active. The person living in our ceiling didn't just break in, they had keys. They knew the 4-digit security pin. They knew our exact vacation schedule. We moved out of that house a month later, but the paranoia followed us, because the police made it very clear. Whoever was living in our walls, watching us sleep and waiting for us to leave, was someone we knew.